Donald Trump just turned his Thanksgiving press briefing into a level of chaos Washington hasn't seen before. A moment that should have been a calm holiday message instead erupted into direct attacks on reporters, a confusing brag about a perfect MRI he couldn't explain,
It's perfect.
and a sweeping declaration to shut America's doors to an entire group of immigrants over a single incident. This wasn't noise. It was a fracture, a sign of a leader slipping deeper into an unstable spiral. And the real question now isn't what he said, but what triggered this shift and how it will shape the decisions he makes next. Because the consequences of this moment may be far larger than the outburst itself. The moment this Thanksgiving event began, the country was still grieving the loss of a 20-year-old National Guardswoman, Sarah Beckman. And here's the part most people forget. On a day meant for reflection and steadiness, the former president did not quiet the room with clarity. Instead, his tone sharpened. His answers quickened. Within moments, he shifted into anger, raising his voice and turning his frustration toward the journalists gathered there. From Washington's side of the story, one reporter cited a straightforward, documented fact. Earlier this year, the Department of Justice's Inspector General reported that the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI had thoroughly vetted the Afghans brought into the United States in 2021. That is what the official record shows. Yet as soon as the question left her mouth, the former president cut her off, labeling her stupid, repeating the word as though the question itself were an offense.
Are you stupid? Are you stupid? Are you stupid?
And while that tense exchange unfolded, pressure was building on the local side of the case. Investigators stated that the suspect had worked closely with American intelligence in Afghanistan, and that his vetting came up clean. That is their account. But the former president dismissed it outright, pointing to the chaotic evacuation flights, insisting that people arrived without proper screening, crowded onto planes, and should never have been here. The room fell silent. Trump struck the table,
Thank you very much.
his face reddening with anger. Then came the question that shifted everything. Your own Department of Justice reported this year that Homeland Security and the FBI thoroughly vetted the Afghans brought into the U.S. So why are you blaming the Biden administration? He did not confirm it. He did not deny it. Instead, he pivoted to a procedural reality that once individuals are flown into the United States, removing them becomes extremely difficult. A structural truth of the immigration system, yes, but still not an answer to the question he had been asked. Next, we turn to a medical disclosure that sounded simple on the surface, but carried far deeper weight. And here is the part most people tend to overlook. When the former president boasted about having a perfect MRI, yet could not say what the doctors had actually scanned, it created not clarity, but a vacuum. And in Washington, a vacuum never stays empty for long. Speculation rushes in instantly. The tension between personal privacy and public transparency becomes sharper. Because a leader's health is never entirely private, it intersects with national security and decision-making capacity. So the structural question emerges. What mechanisms exist to verify information this essential? And how quickly does institutional trust erode when key details are withheld? And while Washington was still processing the unanswered questions around that medical disclosure, another line of pressure hardened even more abruptly. The sweeping call to shut down the border following the shooting involving an Argentine national. And here is the part most people tend to overlook. A single violent incident, still under investigation, with facts, motives, and legal classifications not yet fully established, was immediately leveraged to justify broad restrictions on immigration. These were not narrow adjustments. They represented a decisive shift in national posture. When you step back and look at the system, the impact becomes clearer. Closing the border, even temporarily, places an enormous burden on legal frameworks that were designed to handle due process, not blanket prohibitions. It tests long-standing statutory obligations, including asylum procedures, international commitments, and the constitutional limits of executive authority. And at the state level, the effects were immediate. Governors in several border states reported logistical strain on law enforcement, shelters, and municipal budgets. Local officials noted that sudden closures disrupt not only migration but also cross-border commerce, labor flows, and long-standing community ties. These are system-wide shocks, and they ripple far beyond the courtroom or the briefing room. The stakes are enormous. Border shutdowns reshape lives, fracture families, and, over time, redefine the national identity. They also risk conflating an individual criminal act, a matter for investigators and the courts, with an entire population. That distinction is critical for any society that claims to uphold the rule of law. And once that line blurs, the institutional stress becomes visible. Federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security face conflicting mandates, state governments struggle to maintain stability, and public trust fractures along partisan lines. This is why the question is bigger than one case or one suspect. It touches the architecture of democracy itself, how a nation responds under pressure, how it balances safety with rights, and whether decisions are grounded in evidence or in fear. So the real issue we are left with is not simply the closure of a border, but what that closure signals about the system's trajectory, and how far it is willing to bend as pressure continues to mount. On the Washington side of the story, the reporter tried to bring the conversation back to the documented details. The suspect was Afghan. He had worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. According to officials, he had been vetted. Those are the stated facts. But the former president moved into a broader allegation, not tied to the case, but tied to long-standing political grievances. He spoke about Somali Americans as though they were directly involved, even though they were not part of the incident at all. At the state and local level, the shift hit even harder. Minnesota has struggled with debates over community integration and public trust for years, but conflating one group with another has always been a point of tension. And when you look more closely, you see how this moment reflects that pattern. He claimed Somali communities were ripping off the country, accused them of sending money overseas, and questioned why the United States supports Somalia at all. These are allegations, not verified findings. But they tap directly into existing frustrations among voters who already believe their states are being overwhelmed or ignored by federal institutions. Then he introduced a familiar political target, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, describing her homeland as practically no country, crime-ridden, and devastated. These descriptions reflect his opinion, not an official government assessment, but they served as a launch point for another escalation, framing Minnesota as being taken over, plagued by gangs, and burdened by an incompetent governor. Again, these are his characterizations, not confirmed crime data or administrative evaluations. And this is only the surface of the iceberg, because when you set aside the rhetoric and focus on the structure of the exchange, you can see a system-level pattern emerging. The reporter asked what Somali Americans, especially those here legally, should think about being spoken about in this way. His answer was blunt. They cannot be happy. That response revealed the distance between federal rhetoric and community experience. The question was about the Afghan suspect. The answer became a sweeping commentary on an entirely different population. Meanwhile, the Washington narrative returned once more to the Afghanistan withdrawal. He repeated the claim that many bad ones boarded evacuation planes, asserting there had been no checking at all. That is his assertion, not a confirmed federal account. He described a chaotic scene in which the strongest simply forced their way onto aircraft, suggesting that authorities had no idea who they were. The allegation reflects his view of the evacuation, not the documented vetting process reported by federal agencies. And when you step back, a larger pattern becomes clearer. A local tragedy was absorbed into a national narrative about immigration, identity, and institutional failure. The suspect's background, Afghan, vetted, connected to American intelligence, was overshadowed by a pivot toward unrelated communities. The system's complexity was replaced with broad, emotional claims that paint entire groups with a single brush. So the deeper questions remain, the ones that linger after the cameras stop rolling. What happens when the details of an investigation are overshadowed next? A reporter asked Donald if he's going to be attending the funeral of the National Guardswoman who was killed. And he said, "Maybe, 'cause West Virginia voted for me." Let's play it. It's in the early stages, obviously, but do you plan to attend Sarah's funeral? I haven't thought about it yet, but it certainly is something I could conceive of. I love West Virginia. You know, I won West Virginia by one of the biggest margins of any president anywhere. And these are great people. I love the people of West Virginia. I love the people of our country, but I haven't given it any thought. But it sounds like something I could do. You know, it's very raw. Then Trump says, you can't use the word Indian anymore. Let me show it to you. To the Mohawks. That's our squadron motto. Chop. Oh, good. I love it. Chop. See, we're not allowed to do that anymore. You know, we're not allowed. You're not allowed to use the word Indian anymore. The only ones that want you to are the Indians. All right. I don't think you should ever. Next, Donald Trump claims that National Guard members were shot in D.C. because they've been so effective at stopping crime. Safety for National Guardsmen who are being sent into these cities. No, I just want to have more. As you know, we're sending 500 more. We had very little crime in Washington now for many months. Record setting low crime. And this happened, and I don't know how you put this on the scale of that. This is sort of different. This is a terrorism threat. And this was done because they're so effective. If they weren't effective, you probably wouldn't have had this done. But this was done because the National Guard has been so effective. You know, you went from having a tremendous amount of crime and death, killing, everything else to having none. And this happened, I assume, because it was so effective. And maybe this man was upset because he couldn't practice crime. Who knows what his motivation was? But what he did was horrible. And you've changed for Afghanis. Then on state media on Fox, they had people like Nancy Mace say, you know, this shooting never would have happened if Trump was in office. He's in the office. He granted asylum for the shooter in April. Like, what are we talking about? Well, two things. One, I do agree with Kash Patel on this. But number one, this would never have happened with President Trump in the Oval Office. Number two, President Trump is fixing the grave mistakes and travesties under the Biden administration. And I'm just honored that I'm in Congress to watch and witness what he's doing to save our country. We're going to be so much better off for it. Thank you, Mr. President. And then Donald Trump's communications team starts cursing out reporter Stephen Chung, saying, respectfully shut the F up for trying to politicize this tragedy. And it was just somebody, a reporter, Jane Mayer, saying, this is so tragic, so unnecessary. These poor guardsmen should never have been deployed. I live in D.C. and watch. They had virtually nothing to do but pick up trash. It was for a political show, and at what cost? The head of Trump's communication team says, respectfully shut the F up, and actually curses. By the way, Donald Trump made no Thanksgiving post today at all. Didn't say Happy Thanksgiving. No message. He did post about a golfer who passed away and said, a truly remarkable person and a great golfer who will be truly missed. Then the post before that was from the other day, where Donald Trump talked about his polling numbers and said that his polls remain strong despite the fact that we know Donald Trump's polling is as horrible as can be. Earlier in the morning, Kash Patel talked about how he was asked, so, is it true that the shooter got asylum in 2025 by Trump? And he's like, well, you're going to have to ask Christine Noem that question. And Secretary Christine Noem has put out details specifically related to your other questions. So, I'll let that speak for themselves. When he is going to get asylum, if you could just clarify that timeline, and yes, I believe Christine put that out. And that's a DHS matter, and I'll refer to them. And just so we're very clear about what Donald Trump's actual polling is, data analyst Harry Anton is here on this special Friday. It's been a tough few days for the president in the polls. Yeah, John Berman, I would say this is probably the worst 10-day period for the president in the polls his entire second term. The numbers are just atrocious. What are we talking about here in terms of net approval rating? Well, take a look. These are all November polls. The best one of the group puts him at 14 points underwater. That's the Marquette University Law School poll, tied for the worst he's ever had in that poll. Fox, 17 points underwater. Marist, 17 points underwater. The Reuters Ipsos poll, 22 points underwater. And then taking the cake, the AP North poll, 26 points underwater. When your best poll has you still 14 points underwater, you know it's truly bad. And it's as bad as 26 points underwater. We're talking about an average well, underwater with the deep blue sea swimming with the fishes. And now this is all parties here. If you think this is bad, Harry, if you think this is bad, what is driving these horrific numbers for Donald Trump? Well, why don't we take a look at independents? Trump's net approval rating with independents. Back in January, he was close to even. He was at -4 points. Not great, but not terrible. Look at this number. 43 points underwater with independents in the most recent average of these polls. When you were 43 points underwater with independents, you know you're doing terribly. You can't win with this. If this holds for next year's midterm election, Wave adios, amigos. Goodbye. As the day went on, another storyline emerged, one unfolding far from the shouting in that Thanksgiving press conference. And this is the part most people overlook. In Washington, analysts were reviewing the latest Pew Research validated voter survey, comparing numbers from last year to where things stand now. Among independents, the former president had once been neck and neck with Kamala Harris. Today, he is 43 points underwater. That is not a small fluctuation. It is a collapse. A 40-point swing among the one group both parties fight hardest to win. And when you look closer, you see how the two storylines connect. Washington watches the numbers. States feel the consequences. Independents are walking away not because of a single speech or a single controversy, but because of the same issue that has reshaped elections for more than a decade: inflation, the cost of living, the price of groceries, fuel, housing, the everyday burdens voters over 45 know all too well. Back in January, his approval on the economy was 3 points above water. Now, he is 34 points underwater. That is a 37-point collapse on the one issue where voters once trusted him most. And it raises the deeper question: what does it mean when the very foundation of your support erodes? Meanwhile, outside the borders of the country, another storyline was unfolding, one with stakes far higher than any political poll. While the former president was sparring with reporters, Vladimir Putin was holding his own press conference. He stated that Russia would only agree to a peace deal if Ukraine surrendered all of its eastern territories and withdrew its military from Ukrainian sovereign land. That is the demand, as he stated it, an ultimatum, not a negotiation. And it added a new layer of tension to a day already marked by chaos at home. But when you place these events side by side, a larger pattern emerges. One leader stumbled through a combative press conference. Another leader asserting hardline terms on the global stage. Washington dealing with collapsing support among independents. Local communities are struggling under rising costs. And a country caught between domestic instability and international uncertainty. By the end of the broadcast, the host delivered their closing message, thanking their audience, reminding them that this movement has grown through difficult years, celebrating victories like winning a Webby Award for Podcast of the Year, and urging their supporters to stay engaged as 2026 approaches. It was a call for continuity, for momentum, for unity within their political community. But it also underscored something deeper. Both political coalitions believe they are fighting for the soul of the country. So here is the larger reflection, the part beyond the sound bites. When independents shift by 30 or 40 points, what does that say about the country's direction? How do voters navigate a landscape where domestic turmoil and global conflict collide in real time? What happens when economic pressure reshapes political identity? And how should Americans interpret the contrast between heated rhetoric at home and hardline demands abroad? These are the questions that linger long after the cameras shut off. Questions about power, trust, and the forces shaping the future of the nation.